vanity. What has been is what will be. What has been done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. Ecclesiastes 1. For us men and for our salvation he came down from heaven. By the power of the Holy Spirit he became incarnate from the Virgin Mary and was made man. He ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of the Father. It's obviously from the Creed. And I applied my mind to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceived that this also is but a striving after wind. For in much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. Also from Ecclesiastes. Finally, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. From the Beatitudes, Matthew 5. So here we are, friends. Letter 10 of Valentin Tomberg's Meditations on the Tarot, The Wheel of Fortune. And I think this is a extraordinary letter, I mean, as they all are extraordinary in their own ways. But this one's extraordinary in the way it gives us another way to think about evolution, and also to think about esoteric versions of involution and evolution. It really kind of, and I don't think it's his typical manner of synthesis. Though there are plenty of antinomies in this chapter that he deals at diffusing, I guess we could say. But he just gives us a third way to think about this, a tertium quid, and it's refreshing. It's extraordinarily refreshing. So let's get into it. As he points out in the figure on the card, you have this wheel going around. You have a monkey descending and a dog ascending, and above them there's the Sphinx. And also he points out later in the letter, which I think is pretty remarkable, is this more ancient than the most ancient image in the deck? Because it doesn't. This one's the least Christian in a way. Of all the least medieval of all the images in the major arcana, and so it's an interesting point he makes. It never would have occurred to me, because the idea of the Wheel of Fortune was very present to medieval consciousness. If you've heard Karl Orff's, what's it called? Carmina Burana, and the first piece in that, O Fortuna, right, is about this image, essentially, and about the fickleness of fortune, right? But, if you think of that, then we're thinking in terms of fate, which is antithetical to Christianity, So it is kind of pre-Christian to as an image and as a constellation of images. But here's what he says, okay? Right? Two categories of ideas concerning the genetic relationship and the general genesis of the four kingdoms of nature show up here. The one is based on the fall, degeneration and descent from above below. According to this class of ideas, it is not the monkey who is the ancestor of man, but rather on the contrary, it is man who is the ancestor of the monkey, which latter is a degenerate and degraded descendant. And the three kingdoms of nature below the human kingdom are, according to this set of ideas, the projected residue or exteriorization of the comprehensive being of primordial man, or Adam, who was the original prototype and synthesis of all the entities comprising the four kingdoms of nature. Adam Kadmon. Everything is contained in this prototype of man. And as we said in one of the earlier lectures, I can't remember which one, another notion of Genesis, of Adam naming the animals, is that he named them They came from him, right? They were thrown off. So this is what Tomberg's drawing on right here. But then he talks about the other class of ideas that comprises the idea of evolution. That is the progress transforming from below above, according to this category of ideas. It is the most primitive entity from the point of view of consciousness as well as biological structure, which is the origin of all beings in the four kingdoms of nature, and which is their common ancestor. Now, even though Tomberg doesn't talk about this, we have this depicted in the book of Genesis, in the two creation stories. In the one creation story, the one in the beginning when in the beginning there was nothing, right? There was darkness in the tohu vabohu. There was formless and void. So that one starts from that kind of simplicity to complexity on the sixth day with the creation of man. Goes through all the kingdoms till you get to man. But on the other hand, the second creation story starts with Adam. So this is two different ways to look at this, and it actually they're both depicted in Genesis, which always surprises me that more fundamentalist kinds of Christians who are kind of promulgators of creation science never talk about that second story of Genesis. Now, so here's the two pictures on this image, on the involution and the evolution picture. What do we do with this? And he says on page 235, because we're talking about fall and reintegration, right? So, falling from this primeval Edenic state into the fallen nature of the world we see. But now there's also the idea of ascent back into reintegration or second coming or the resurrection body, however you want to put it. But they're contrary ideas, and later he talks about similar contrary ideas, which even in standard science, the contrary ideas of heredity, which means you bring everything from your parents, that heredity defines who you are, but which is kind of short-circuited by the idea of evolution, where things are always improving, where we're gaining. So how do you rectify those two things? And he points out no one ever talks about that, and it's true. But here he continues on 235. He says, because one has to renounce thought and reduce it to lethargy in order to be able to sincerely believe that man evolved from the primitive and unconscious particles of a primordial mist, which was once our planet, without this mist bearing within itself the seed of all possibilities for future evolution, which is the process of eclosion. That is the process of transition from a potential state to an actual state. And then he continues. And he says, and he gives a couple of quotes from two scientific texts, one which questions evolution and one which questions the questioning of evolution. And the second from William S. Beck's Modern Science and the Nature of Life calls it metaphysical brocade, right? To that, the idea that there's something other than just evolution. And Tomberg says, metaphysical brocade or not, it does not matter. The fact of the unintelligibility for human thought of the theory, not the facts, of evolution advanced by science nevertheless remains a fact. It is and always will be unintelligible insofar as it takes consideration of only half of the whole circle of evolution and refuses to accept the other half of the circle, that of involution, or the fall, which would make it intelligible. And I think it's true. That's the only way I can understand evolution, is in terms of the fall. And I know I mentioned this before, but if we think of Adam and Eve in a different even biological, I don't know what that's the right word, but different constitution prior to the fall. And as it says in Genesis, that after the fall, they put on coats of skin. And that doesn't, I don't think that means skins of animals. It means coats of skin. I mean, they were encased in skin at that point. So I think their condition was probably very different. I don't want to venture to guess what it was like, but it probably wasn't like what we have now. And then, if we take evolution into consideration, then evolution makes sense, because if you think of man then falling, not just to the point where you have to work for a living and feel pain in childbirth, but then all of creation kind of collapses into a primitive state from which evolution then would begin. I mean, that's the only way I can understand it. It's the only way, and I think it's a good way. I don't know. I haven't really totally fleshed this idea out, but that's, intuitively where I stand in regard to this. But then, pardon me, Tomberg goes on, and now he takes on the Blavatskyan theosophists, even Rudolf Steiner, and especially Rudolf Steiner's early work in cosmology. And this is what he says, 236. The doctrine of the circle of involution and evolution is generally a platitude of occult literature. Oh, I know, because we know better than you do, because we're occultists. But it is not so when it is the matter of involution understood as the fall and evolution understood as salvation. There's a world of difference between the Orientalist doctrine concerning the semi-automatic process of involution and evolution, and the Hermetic, biblical, and Christian doctrine concerning the fall and salvation. That's an important point. And that's also, why Rudolf Steiner had to blow the whistle on the Theosophists when he left them, because they did not get Christianity. It's not a religion amongst other religions. Right? And as Tomberg goes on, the former sees in the circle of involution and evolution only a purely natural process, similar to the process of respiration in a living organism. The Hermetic, biblical, and Christian tradition, in contrast, sees here a cosmic tragedy and drama, full of the supreme dangers and risks that the traditional terms perdition and salvation imply. Right? So, if you've read Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine, for example, makes a big deal about this idea of Manvantara and Pralaya, of the entire cosmos always going through this process of death and rebirth and gradual complexity. And Steiner does this too in his book Occult Science, which is right over there on my shelf, I believe. But it's lacking something, his idea. It's lacking, as Tomberg says, the cosmic tragedy and drama. It's a resigned, it's a philosophy grounded in resignation in a way. It's just how it is. But I know I have secret knowledge, suckers. And we don't have to. It's horrible to think that way. And that's why Tomberg continually emphasizes humility on this path. You think you have secret knowledge? What does that make you? Anything important? I don't think so. Let me grab my notebook here. All right, so let's continue. And then, he does it. In fact, right after this, he talks about humility. But then he gives what I think is a really brilliant little piece of literary work. This myth he wrote or recorded or invented, explaining what he's talking about here. And I won't read the whole thing. It's pretty long. It's on page 239. But I just want to point out a couple things that he brings to our attention there. And he talks about, thus the seventh day is blessed and sanctified because it is the day not of the world and the movement of the world, but rather of the Father himself alone. It is the seventh part of the circle of the movement of the world. When he, this is the key, withdraws and becomes immobile and silent. Now, as we talked before, this is another one of Tomberg's themes of Tzimtzum, God's withdrawal of his energies, or his making a space open for creation to happen. And then he continues a little bit, talking about the serpent. There's serpent who says, there is no freedom for the world in as far as the circle of the world is not closed. Right? Which immediately conjures up, which he will bring up later, the famous image of the snake with its tail in its mouth, which the Blavatsky Theosophists adopted as their symbol, right? Which Howard makes kind of a big deal about in this letter. And but then, pay attention to this toward the bottom. But woman guarded the memory of the world open towards the Father and the holy Sabbath. And she offered herself for the rending of the closed circle in herself, in order to give birth to children issuing from the world beyond it, from the world where there is the Sabbath. Thus originated the suffering of her pregnancy, and thus originated sorrow on this side of the world, the serpent. That woman has a name, Sophia, who accompanies God in the creation, but who also, I always think of Sophia in creation as the catalyst, almost like an organ of perception that makes grace receivable and palpable, because she brings something. She's the vessel through which grace, and then grace as Christ enters into the world, right? Brings in, this is creativity. This is the light of the first day, as we've talked before. And as he says at the end of his myth here, the woman virgin, who is the soul of the counter movement to the serpent, and of suffering since the beginning of the world of the serpent, received, conceived, and gave birth to the Word of the Father. So, Virgin Mary, Virgin Sophia. Right? And so he gives us these two ideas of the open circle and the closed circle, and he gives us two different versions, or several different versions of the open circle, and one is the Buddhist version. Buddhism is a touchstone for him, which is open, but as a means of escape. Whereas in Solomon, especially the quotations from Ecclesiastes, there's another take on the open circle, even though there's also an admission that everything happens the same. And then the third is from Nietzsche, who is all about the closed circle. Everything repeats, and he loves it. So Solomon wants to escape from it, from the repetition, and Nietzsche revels in it. So where does this leave us then? Well, I think it's interesting that Tomberg then brings science into the conversation again. And he talks about how this eternal return, which is Nietzsche's idea, right? He compares it to the scientific dogma of the quantitative constancy of matter and energy in the world, right? Nothing disappears, nothing appears in the world. The sum total of matter and energy in the world is constant, right? That's a closed circle right there. And then he talks about how miracles they prove that that's not the case, but scientists don't believe in miracles very often. So let's talk about miracles a little bit. Now, I don't know if you've seen any miracles. I mean, people can convince themselves they've seen miracles. But miracles are pretty common. And I don't mean the miracle of birth, which is a miracle, but I mean the miracle in the sense that Tomberg's talking here, where something enters this sphere from outside, right? Outside of the closed circle, so to speak. Miracles that prove that the circle's open. And I'm going to share a couple of my own personal experiences because I've seen it with my own eyes. There's a few of them. Well, one of them, the first one I think I saw was my wife and I were first married. So that's a while ago. And I heard from a friend of mine who's an anthroposophist who was still kind of Catholic, also kind of Buddhist at the same time. And he was suffering from some kind of tumors. And so he was looking for ways to heal himself and to get healed. And he, in his search, he visited this Eastern Orthodox church in the Detroit area, St. Frenarius. And what happened at St. Frenarius, this is about 1991, 92. What happened is on, I think it was Palm Sunday on the Eastern calendar that year. They had an icon of Saint Frenarius, who's kind of a mysterious saint. Nobody really knows who he is. Somebody found an icon of him. He holds a taper, looks like a knight. But on Palm Sunday, I think it was, and this is an icon that had a glass cover over it. On Palm Sunday, when the priest went into the church in the morning, and where the figure in the icon is holding a taper, on the glass around it became etched in the glass shaped like the flame, so almost like a halo on the flame. And the following Sunday, which was of course Easter, another halo showed up on the glass that corresponded to the halo of the figure in the picture, right? St. Frenarius. So my friend told me, you gotta go check it out. So I went to check it out. My friend is a little clairvoyant. He's a little very sensitive. And so my wife and I went to check it out. It was a really tiny church. I mean, I bet if it seated 50 people, I'd be shocked. It's a tiny, tiny place. And here we saw this. The priest figured out we were Catholic because we were crossing ourselves, not like in an Eastern fashion. And we went up and venerated the icon, and just sat there praying. And the priest was talking to us, telling us about how things happened. And as I went up to venerate the icon, I felt almost like electricity going from the icon to a little box that was or a case or something that was in front of the icon stand, in front of the icon of, in front of the icon of Christ. And so I went to look at it, and I didn't know what I was doing. And I looked at it and I said, what's this stuff over here? And the priest said, oh, there we have a relics. And we have a relic of the Virgin Mary there. A Roman Catholic priest friend of mine gave it to me. And it wasn't, a bone or something from the Virgin Mary. It was something from her clothing. But I swear, it was like electricity was going from, or some kind of energy was going from that relic straight across to the icon. And that's, and that was my experience. But then a week or two later, I bumped into my friend. I said, hey, we visited that church and saw that icon. And he looked at me right in the eye and said, it's the relic of Mary. So that was what it was, He felt it too. So that was one of the miracles I saw. Another one also had to do with an Eastern Orthodox church where an icon of the Virgin Mary started weeping oil, they call it weeping, on one of her feasts. I can't remember which one it was now. And this was not in a church, it was in some woman's house. And she brought it to a church and started to tour some of the Orthodox churches in Michigan around that time. I don't know where it is now. This was about 1997 or so, 96. And so I went to see it. I had a landscaping business at the time, and I was out designing gardens and planting trees, and I happened to drive by the church where this icon was on display, and I went in there to see it. And it wasn't just weeping a little bit of oil. It was weeping quarts a day. And it was tested. They found it to be absolutely pure virgin olive oil, with nothing mixed in it. And how it come out of this wooden icon that wasn't made of olive wood. That's a miracle, right? So those are two of the miracles. There's a couple more which I won't mention. But those two, I think, they came from someplace. And I've mentioned these to, skeptics and agnostics, and how you can explain it? And they try to rationalize it, but there's no explaining it. And there's also, I haven't met these people, but people I know have met this woman. There's called the miracle of Our Lady of Sufania in Syria, where a woman named Myrna, I think her name is, I can't remember her last name. Well, she started having these experiences where chrism oil would come out of her hands and out of her eyes, and she also experienced the stigmata whenever the feast of Easter fell on the same day for both Orthodox and Catholics. And the message of that feast is let the feast be, or that apparition, I guess we could call it, there are miracles there, is that let the feast be one. Here, let the feast should be one. I'm telling you right now. But here, oil is coming out of a woman's body, and it's olive oil. It's not, human secretions. So you can't explain that either. So these miracles, as Tomberg explains on page 243, for a miracle to be possible, the world must be an open circle. The world must be a spiral. That is, it must have an uncreated sphere, or a Sabbath, according to the cosmic sphere narrated above. Right? And so, in all religions, as he points out, know that it's an open circle. Right? It's only science that doesn't think it's an open, or science and materialism think it's a closed circle. Right? And then he also intimates around the same page, the idea of hell can be understood as eternal existence in a closed circle. And he doesn't follow this one up here, but this is, as we talked before, this is the idea of a hakotastasis, the salvation of all. Because if the world is not a closed circle, and he just proved it's not, neither can hell be. And then he goes from this, he segues into, he uses the example of Leibniz, Schopenhauer, and Hermeticism, right? Leibniz is pure thought and optimism. This is the best of all possible worlds. Schopenhauer, complete pessimism, right? And then, what do we do with this? What was Christian Hermeticism? Which is the way of the heart. What does it say? And I love this. It's actually page 245. The heart says to us, the cosmos, this marvel of wisdom, beauty, and goodness, suffers. It is ailing. This great organism which cannot have been born out of sickness, whose birth must have been due to perfect health, that is, to perfect wisdom, beauty, and goodness, the totality of which was its cradle, this great organism is ailing. The continents and the planets grow ever more hard, petrifying. This is the sclerosis of the cosmos. And on the surface of its land masses, in the process of petrification, and in the deeps of its seas, and in the air, there reigns the struggle for existence. This is the fever of inflammation in the world. Right? But sick as it is, he says, the world still retains, everywhere and always, characteristics of its primordial health, and shows the working of forces of its new health, its convalescence. Because alongside the struggle for existence, there is cooperation in order to live. And alongside the mineral petrification, there is the succulent and breathing cover of the plant kingdom. The world can therefore be lauded and wept for at the same time. Now, this is, I think, you look at this in every sphere of activity on this world, in the world of the serpent, in a way. You can see where the Edenic layer shines through. Or, as I've said before, in speaking in terms of sophiology, where the anticipation of the resurrection body shines through. Because I think it would be a mistake to equate the Edenic layer with the resurrection body is perfectly congruent. I think they're in many ways congruent, but I think the resurrection body is the Edenic layer plus something, plus more. It's not just a return to a state; it's a move forward. But I also think that, so if we consider this kind of Darwinian evolution that he's talking about as a sickness, and you can see it's a sickness in creation, right? Things aren't getting better, from the primitive state. Evolution is apparently not moving toward beauty, truth, and goodness. That comes from someplace else. But the other thing we have to consider is in human social arrangements, social Darwinism is what I'm thinking of in particular. Right, dog eat dog. Right, that kind of brutality of our economic systems, whether you're talking about the capitalist system or the socialist system, especially Tomberg, whose parents and brother were killed by the Bolsheviks. They didn't have much love for the communists. You look at those brutal systems, and which is the survival of the fittest, right? Everybody else, screw them. That's what It's what, if you think about the current situation in economics, why is it that unless one's an entrepreneur, you're doomed to poverty, to relative poverty? Doesn't make any sense. There's a better way to live, apparently. And as Tomberg says, the world is not what it should be. And I think you can't just talk about the creation and say it's not what it should be. You got to say that the human world is not what it should be. Though, as he points out, when we have moments of cooperation, right, that's the antithesis to that world of the serpent, to the world of evolution, right? That's the antidote to it. And that's why, I think, I don't know if you know too much about distributism and communitarianism, which seem to me to be social ways of being worth investigating more. They're kind of, unfortunately, usually only promulgated by people who want to live as hobbits. They have a very strong Tolkien inspiration behind them, which is nothing wrong with that. But I think you got to take it to the future. You can't get it stuck in a literary glass case. You got to actually do something. And this is Rudolf Steiner was probably the thing I most love about him is he did not just leave anything at the theoretical level. He said everything had to become practical. You had to do it. So I think with people who talk about communitarianism or distributism, don't just talk about it. Do it. And if you make mistakes, so what? Keep going until you get it, right? Eventually people will catch on. I think that's what Jesus did, right? He didn't wait till he had a church. He said, come and follow me. So something to think about. Because I think, obviously it's not just the biology and the cosmos that's fallen. Most importantly, it's the man that's fallen. The cosmos accompanied us on the fall. We took the cosmos down, right? Don't forget that. And it continues in this vein a little bit. And he's talking about how science thinks of nature. Nature has two faces for science. It's benign and cruel, and at the one and the same time. Nature both stubborn and astonishingly cooperative. Wise and blind nature. Nature the loving mother and the cruel stepmother, full of malice. Right? And he says this commits the same error that a doctor would commit if he were to consider a state of sickness as normal or natural. Right? And what Tomberg brings to our attention here is we have to think this about not as terms of natural, just the way it is, but as natural and unnatural. Unnatural. Right? Sickness is an unnatural state. And he says here, page 246, Hermeticism, in accordance with the Judeo-Christian tradition, regards the nature of science, not as the world created by God, but rather as the field where the created world meets with the world of the serpent. And here's again, if science ever opens itself up to the vertical dimension, what could happen? What could possibly happen? And then he does a wonderful job of bringing up religious dualisms, right? Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism, certain Gnostic schools. Just as science, and he says, just as science refuses to distinguish in nature between the nature of orthogenesis and cooperation on the one hand, and the nature of producing genetic impasses and parasites on the other hand, so did the Manichaeans, Cathars, Albigensians, etc., refuse to distinguish between virginal nature and fallen nature. And I don't know if you know about this, and I really, I shouldn't say distresses me, but kind of disgusts me how various esoteric schools kind of romanticize the Albigensians and the Cathars and the Manichaeans, you know, and anthroposophists tend to be really rotten at this because how can, you know, because they uphold this dualism. I don't know where they get this, right? Because it's like not really thinking clearly is what it is. Because you have to be able to distinguish between nature and fallen nature. And perhaps this is the gift of Christian Hermeticism, is giving us a lens through which to see that. Because how else could you see it? You know, and this is why Tomberg keeps going back and forth between these polarities throughout the book, these antinomies, right? With Leibniz's optimism versus Schopenhauer's pessimism, and showing us that they both have points, but guess what? The heart, the way of the Christian Hermeticists, short circuits those by penetrating into the truth of the matter and not getting caught at a polarity. And then he talks about another antinomy, right, with the way of enfoldment of the serpent and the way of radiation of the children of darkness and the children of light, or the world of light and the world of darkness, the world of the serpent, right? And then he from there, he gets into the. It might seem to be a digression, but I think it is. But it's certainly a sidebar about what is it with all these occultists romanticizing the serpent, right? I think with who is it? Blavatsky, of course, as we already mentioned, but Levi, I mean, I have a lot of respect for, and Stanislas de Guaita. I'm not sure how it's pronounce his name. And, you know, what is it with the romanticizing of the serpent? Right? What is with it? And then he points out that it wasn't the serpent that John the Baptist saw descend upon the master of sacred magic, the greatest thaumaturgist of history, but rather a dove. Right? The dove. So what is the dove? Of course it's the Holy Spirit, but it's more than the Holy Spirit in this reading. And Tomberg says, and I won't read the whole thing, but he says, the 7 miracles of St. John's Gospel did not have the serpent as their agent, nor was the brain the instrument of their accomplishment, nor was cerebral intellectuality the source of their initiative. The agent here is the dove, the spirit which is above the brain, above the head, which descends upon the head and remains there, the spirit which transcends cerebral intellectuality. And then he said, I love this, I ask you, dear unknown friend, why occultist authors have not directed their zeal, fervor, and ability to serve the cause of the dove instead of that of the serpent? Me too. Gotta wonder. Because they're trying to be other? I don't get it. I wrote here's my note, my marginalia. Yeah, what's with that? What is with that? Now, in my own philosophical work, theological work, in sociology, this is my position, as Tomberg points out here, is not a dwelling, and I think the serpent is, in one way, the cleverness that he's talking about here, and we see the cleverness depicted, and it's not just depicted or figured in science, in the sciences, in computer science or mathematics. It's figured just as much in theology and philosophy, and since the Enlightenment in particular, but especially in the postmodern era, the serpent has kind of taken over those disciplines as well. So my position in my book, The Submerged Reality, for example, that's why I called it subtitled Sophiology and the Turn to a Poetic Metaphysics, because what I'm talking about there is exactly what Tomberg's talking about here, is finding something that transcends cerebral intellectuality, which is, I call a poetic metaphysics or a poetic apprehension. Owen Barfield talks a bit about this in his book, Saving the Appearances, right? So how do we, and this is, I guess, Rudolf Steiner would call it intuitive thinking, right? How do you reach to an intuition? Because you get stuck in this intellectual, and this is what the intellectual realm is a dialectic. It's constant dialectic, yes and no, right? Yes, no, right? Debate. But then, that will never come to a resolution, as Ralph Waldo Emerson said, an argument convinces nobody. So how do we transcend it? How do we find a different intuition? Or I shouldn't say a different intuition. How do we find an intuition into what is, rather than getting stuck in this intellectual dialectic that can never be resolved? And Tomberg is talking about it in this chapter, or this letter, right? And he says on page 251, pardon me, thanks to the work of salvation, which has a millennial-old history, a gradual spiritualization of the work of the serpent, including cerebral intellectuality, has taken place. And because intervention from above not only frustrates the formation of a completely closed circles, but also gives to the tendency of unfoldment a direction towards solidarity through stages such as the family, the nation, and the community of civilization. In other words, Providence sees to it that the circles formed by the serpent are not entirely closed. Right? So, poetic intuition, or short circuits this closed circle of the serpent. Just like those miracles I talked about earlier, short-circuited the closed circle of scientific cleverness. right? They're no, and if you talk to people, it's funny the kind of materialist people I've talked to about those things. I say, well, what about this? They're like, it can be explained. I can't explain it, but it can be explained. Well, have at it. Go find somebody, but they never look for anybody. And just to finish this part up, let's talk. And then he continues. For the reality and entirety of evolution consists on the one hand of the unfolding activity of the serpent, which has formed the brain and produced cerebral intellectuality, and the other hand of the activity of the light from above, which opens the enfolded and illumines cerebral intellectuality. The serpent and the dove, these are, in the last analysis, the factors underlining the whole process of evolution. Right? You need the entire process. You need the spiritual or poetic dimension as well. You know, because in our culture certainly doesn't pay attention to that. Or, you know, what's that one website? I effing love science. You know, come on. And people, and this is what has given the rise to scientism, which meaning treating science as a doctrine of handed down beliefs, and it's phony from the get go. And then after this, Tomberg brings reincarnation back into the conversation, which I think it won't get into this time. It's going to come up in the 13th letter, and we talked about it quite a bit already. But he does talk about animality, right? You have these figures on the card that the dog, the monkey, and the sphinx, and the dog and the monkey are animals unto themselves, and the sphinx is kind of an amalgam. And I think that Tomberg, his discussion here is pretty interesting, and he talks about there are different kinds of animality. It's page 256 or 257, around there, right? There is created animality, and there is evolved animality. The former had its origin before the fall, and the latter owes its existence to evolution since the fall, that is, to the work of the serpent. There is, so, animality. Archetypal animality, I guess we could say. And he says that the animality of divine origin is summarized by the four prototypes or kind of the holy Hayath, the cherubim, or the holy living creatures, they're called also. These are the bull, the lion, the eagle, and the angel or man. And if one unites these four prototypes in one sole being, one obtains the Sphinx. Aha! That's what he's getting at with the Sphinx, who stands above. It's an integration of these animalities. And the other instincts are due to the evolution of the serpent. They are summarized by the term bestiality. And I don't know if you're familiar with this sequence of poems, the Bestiary by the French poet Guillaume Apollinaire. It's also called the Parade of Orpheus. He's got a wonderful poem about St. John the Baptist, it's actually the poem on the grasshopper, who becomes a feast for the best of men, meaning John the Baptist. So Apollinaire kind of is working with those with a higher animality in his bestiary in a way, And even though you can never call him a religious poet, there is certainly a religious or devotional aspect to his work, especially his poem Zone, if you ever get to read that. But in these little poems in the bestiary, he's dealing with ideal figurations of the animals of which he writes, and it's very charming. It's worth reading. But Tomberg is talking about these holy living creatures, and it's no accident that the holy living creatures make their first appearance in the Old Testament, the book of Ezekiel, the chariot, right? but it's a wheel, right? It's called a chariot, but it's I think it's inaccurate. It's a wheel. Ezekiel's wheel, and this is the wheel of fortune, right? Which kind of gives emphasis or underlines the appearance of the Sphinx on this card, with the holy living creatures as the Sphinx as a combination of their attributes. It's kind of a brilliant insight, I think, on Tauberg's part. I certainly wouldn't have come up with it. And he's trying to figure out how to integrate the qualities, the higher qualities of animality into our own spiritual lives. And he calls this the task of inner alchemy, the transmutation of fallen instincts into their non-fallen prototypes, which is the work of Hermeticism in general, right? How is this to be done, he asks. And he says, by way of metamorphosis, that is, by alternating contraction and expansion, just as the growth of a plant is the manifestation of two tendencies, a vertical tendency and a horizontal tendency, operating alternately so that the former pushes upwards and the latter affects its blossoming out. So does psychic metamorphosis operate by restriction of the expansive tendency, which results in elevation, followed by expansion on the new plane, attained by elevation, which in turn will be followed by restriction, resulting in a new elevation, and so forth. It's Goethean metamorphosis is what it is, and he gives Goethe some props in the next couple sentences. But also notice that this is both the horizontal path of the serpent as well as the vertical path of the dove combined, right? Because that's where we are, right? We can't do all. If you're a Hermeticist, you are still stuck in duration, right? You're here in this world, and the serpent is a reality in this world. So how can you do this? And if you think about this, Hermeticism so often in this book is about the balance, is about not going too far to one side or too far to the other side. If you go too far toward the serpent, you become encased in matter in a way, right? Like a materialist scientist. If you go too far toward the dove, you're excarnated, right? And you can see, if you know much anthroposophy, what underlies this is also Steiner's polarities of Lucifer and Ahriman, right? Lucifer, who wants to take you out of yourself and express your individuality, and Ahriman, who wants to encase you in numbers, basically, in code. But for us, where we are, we have to find a way to integrate those, in the way of the heart. The marriage of opposites, this traditional theme of alchemy, is the essence of the practice of the law of the cross. Right? And that's what we're doing. And then he gets into an interesting notion when he talks about whether or not the tarot card image of the Wheel of Fortune is the least evolved of the 22 cards of the major arcana. But he says, hey, look, the tarot is not a wheel, a closed circle, but rather a spiral. It evolves through tradition and reincarnation. Right? It's not inherited, it's reincarnated in conformity with the experience of modern depth psychology of the school of Jung. Right? It's retrieved. Now, from where is retrieved? The Akashic record. I don't know. I don't know if I want to even use terminology of the unconscious. It's retrieved from someplace. And he says on page 262, they are therefore inscribed magically in a region between heaven and earth, close enough to the earth to be reached by the souls of seekers on the earth and to awake in them the spirit of quest through their attraction, and far enough removed, on the other hand, so as never to be seized by cerebral intellectuality, that is, to be taken hold of, analyzed, and exploited by it. And this is what I've called poetic metaphysics, right? This is, you know, if you know, try to explain a poem, that's the best way to kill it, right? Analyze a poem. This is what Rudolf Steiner called compared picking up a work of literary criticism to touching a corpse. You know, it's dead. You've killed it. You've killed what was beautiful in the poem by this analysis. You know, by projecting your own ego into it. You know, so to arise to a poetic intuition or poetic metaphysics, this is what Tomberg's talking about here. You know, this is how we do it. We elevate oneself above the zone of cerebral intellectuality, because the sacred books were written according to the Hermetic treatises that we've quoted before the formation of the brain. Right? This region, this garden of the holy symbols of the cosmic elements, planted between heaven and earth, is the reality of Hermeticism. So in a way, Hermeticism is a way of being in a poetic metaphysics, because it's above cerebral intellectuality, right? And he speaks on page 264. To follow this up, here is the fundamental error of all metaphysical philosophy from Plato to the present time. It hypostatizes ideas. Ideas live only in the consciousness of individuals, or are present in potency in books. In visibly written books, such as the Holy Scripture. In invisible books, which are living spiritual monuments due to the operation of divine magic. And lastly, in the whole world, which is also a great book containing in potency the ideas of its creation and destiny expressed through the symbolism of facts. So we could say invisibly written books. And he points to Scripture, certainly, but poetry, I mean, not all poetry, yes. You know, books that open up the world to you. That's what he's talking about, right? And the other polarity is the book of the world. And this is, he's drawing on that ancient Catholic idea of the two books, the book of Scripture and the book of nature. But he also adds to it a third book, the invisible book, which is the living spiritual monuments due to the operation of divine magic. Right? So we have the two polarities, the book of nature, which is also the book Science Studies, and the book of Scripture, which is also the book Theology Studies. And there's this other book, which Hermeticism studies, but I think which poetry also studies. I shouldn't say studies. Poetry also exists in, where the poet also lives in that world, the artist. And if you think about it, the sublime poets and artists provide us with a vocabulary for the spirit, right? Because they provide us with symbols. They speak in symbols. They don't speak in explanations. Speak in figures, like the tarot. They're figures. They're not explanations. And even what Tomberg is doing here in his meditations on the tarot is not to be taken as even definitive. I don't think anybody else could have read this book and come up with the same insights. Yet the insights he comes up with are something many people can relate to and see themselves in, right? So that's an important thing to keep in mind, because later in the book he'll try to hand on the baton. In Danger, Will Robinson. We need to think about that and what that really means. But in the meantime, as he points out in his last two apologies to the professor and to the priest, because I'm a Hermeticist, I can't help myself. And this is, we said before, this to be a Hermeticist is kind of a vocation. There's no money in it. You're called to it because you're just, for whatever reason, you've incarnated with this desire to know. Right? It doesn't make you, and because you're a collector of esoteric data, doesn't make you any better than anybody else. In fact, you get the sense when Tauberg gets to this letting go of intellectuality, cerebral intellectuality. There's a sense of it in the literary critic and also popular intellectual Stanley Fish has this idea of the self-consuming artifact in 17th century, especially devotional literature, where his idea is that the thing is designed, so whether it's a poem by George Herbert, but it's designed where you have to let go of rationality in order to get it. So even the fact that you're using rationality to read this poem, you can't really read this poem until you let go of it. And Fish he compares it to climbing a ladder while someone's pulling out the rungs you just stepped on. So you're using cerebral intellectuality to understand Hermeticism. So you're getting, whether it's sense of what the planets do, what this planet stand for, yes, all that stuff. It's very cerebral. But then what happens when you're letting go of that, when the dove descends, you're getting all that pulled out from under you, and now you can't rely on that anymore. And now you have to just keep going, right? Reminds me of a dream I had when I was a kid. I used to have this recurring dream that I would climb this tree in my backyard, and that the tree would disappear underneath me, and I would keep going. I would just keep going toward the moon, And I think what Fish is talking about with his idea of the self-consuming artifact, that Hermeticism becomes a self-consuming artifact because you have to let go of all the conceptual world you have built to actually arrive at the destination. And you don't get there all at once. I mean, you get a glimpse, and then you go back to a cerebral intellectuality because you got to pay the bills. You got to bounce a checkbook. But that's still what exists there, right? And as Tauberg says in the very end here, he says, I know that the truths of salvation revealed and transmitted by the council of the Holy Church are both necessary and sufficient. Sufficient is an important word for salvation. I have no doubt whatever that they are true, and I strive to do my best to practice them. But I am unable to arrest the current of the river of thought which bears me towards mysteries that perhaps are meant only for saints, perhaps only for angels. In any case, that I know without doubt are reserved for beings far more worthy than me. And then he ends with a proper place to end. I will not let you go until you have blessed me.